Chapters 32 and 33, Summary and Analysis. Summary. It is September 1802. Visiting a friend in northern England, Lockwood realises he is only 14 miles away from Thrushcross Grange. Acting on impulse, he decides to spend the night there, since he is still paying rent to Heathcliff for the house. On arriving, he meets an unfamiliar servant, who tells him Nellie has moved into Wuthering Heights. Curious, Lockwood walks over to see how everyone is doing. There is something different about the formerly foreboding place. The gate is no longer locked against visitors, and flowers bloom profusely in the garden. Most strangely, he spies Cathy and Hareton engaged in a reading lesson interrupted by kisses and other signs of affection. Unseen, Lockwood slides past them into the kitchen, where Nellie sits singing as she sews. She is delighted to see Lockwood again, but is surprised to discover that he is unaware of Heathcliff's death 3 months ago. As Lockwood sips some ale, she narrates the story of his queer death. 2 weeks after Lockwood's departure, Nellie is summoned to the Heights. Heathcliff explains that he no longer wishes to see Cathy, so he wants Nellie to move in and make a small apartment for herself and the girl. The arrangement soon proves unsatisfactory. Cathy resents being confined to a small space all day, and is reduced to fighting with Joseph in the kitchen. Hareton also frequents the kitchen, where he continues to be the victim of Cathy's scorn. One day, Cathy relents, and offers to let Hareton try to read one of her books. When he rebuffs her offer, she leaves the book beside him. Still unable to make amends, Cathy finally approaches Hareton and awkwardly proposes to become friends, despite her awareness that he has always hated her. Furious at being faulted, Hareton claims that he has risked Heathcliff's wrath often in taking her part, only to have endured her constant ridicule. Eventually, her persistence overcomes his damaged pride, and the cousins sit together looking at a book. An affectionate relationship rapidly develops. Nellie interrupts herself to admit to Lockwood that she is glad he did not try to win Cathy's love, since a wedding between Cathy and Hareton now seems inevitable. It will be, reports Nellie, quote, the crown of all her wishes, unquote. Returning to the events of 3 months earlier, Nellie relates how Cathy has persuaded Hareton to dig up some old currant trees, favourites of Joseph, and replace them with flowers transplanted from the Grange. Later at a meal, Nellie notes that Cathy has decided not to hide their relationship from Heathcliff any longer, and flirts with Hareton at the table. Heathcliff shoots a surly glance at the pair, but says nothing until Joseph bursts in, screaming about the loss of his trees. Learning that it was Cathy's idea, Heathcliff turns on her for having touched his property. Emboldened, Cathy points out that Heathcliff has not only stolen everything from her, but from Hareton as well. When Cathy threatens to use her influence to turn Hareton against him, Heathcliff orders Hareton to get rid of her. Clearly torn between his loyalty to Heathcliff and his love for Cathy, Hareton begs her to stop. She refuses, and Heathcliff grabs her by the hair. Intervening, Hareton pleads with him not to hurt her. Shaken, Heathcliff lets her go, and calmly tells her to avoid provoking him. Warning Hareton not to be influenced by Cathy unless he wants to be turned out, Heathcliff allows the scene to end without violence. Alone later in the house, Hareton tells Cathy he will not endure any criticisms of Heathcliff, to whom Hareton is unquestionably devoted. Astounded at first by his attachment to the man who ruined him, Cathy realizes that Hareton regards Heathcliff as a father figure, and to try to convince him of Heathcliff's injustice would be more cruel than helpful. Reconciled, the two continue with their reading lessons. Observing them, Nellie reflects on how her hand in both their upbringing, as the only mother either has ever known, she regards them both as her children. She is proud of them. Hareton's innate goodness has helped him overcome his childhood of neglect and violence, while Cathy has outgrown her juvenile petulance and is now a worthy young woman. While Nellie is thinking this over, Heathcliff returns. As the two look up, Heathcliff is overwhelmed by their mutual resemblance to Catherine. Composing himself, he bids them leave the room, but asks Nelly to remain. In a lengthy soliloquy, Heathcliff dwells on the ironic conclusion to his plan for revenge. After nearly a lifetime devoted to the destruction of the Earnshaws and Lintons, he finds himself disinclined to impinge on Hareton's and Cathy's happiness. This is not due to any generosity on his part. It is just that hurting them has ceased to give him satisfaction. He senses a significant change in himself, in that all of his vengeful passion has turned into complete apathy. While Cathy is truly insignificant to Heathcliff, Hareton moves him deeply. The young man reminds him of himself as a youth, yet, if it could be managed, Heathcliff would prefer to avoid him, since Hareton's strong resemblance to Catherine is a constant reminder of his loss. Listening to him, Nelly seizes on his use of the word change. Viewing him as sound of mind as she, accepting his obsession with Catherine, she is alarmed to think that the change he refers to is death. He tells her he is not ill. Life, however, has become too difficult to endure. The attainment of his revenge has lost its meaning, and he is left exhausted by the struggle, wishing only that it were over. Discussion and analysis. These chapters contain a certain poignance. The reader cannot help but be moved by Hareton's unwavering devotion to Heathcliff. It must be recalled that Hareton is basically unaware of how he has been cheated. Furthermore, Heathcliff represents the only father Hareton has ever really known. Hindley, we recall, frequently terrorized the child while drunk, and died before Hareton could have tried to understand the causes of his father's misery. Heathcliff, on the other hand, has always demonstrated a gruff affection for the boy, and in fact tells us in chapter 33 that he views Hareton as, quote, a personification of my youth, unquote. It is touching as well to observe Cathy's increasing maturity. She has the capability to use Hareton's love for her as a tool against Heathcliff, but she wisely chooses not to. She recognizes that Hareton needs to believe in Heathcliff and is content to allow Hareton's attachment to Heathcliff to remain. Most important, it is in these chapters that Heathcliff reclaims our sympathy. Lives have been gravely altered by his machinations. Certainly, Hindley's ruination was at Heathcliff's hand. Had Bronte permitted Heathcliff to achieve the complete ruination of the two families, we might well be tempted to write him off as a purely evil monster. However, Bronte makes it clear that redemption is at hand for Hareton and Cathy, the second generation. Flowers, transplanted from Thrushcross Grange, flourish in the soil of Wuthering Heights, symbolizing the transference of goodness to a house of abject misery. Unbarred gates replace the sealed, jail-like atmosphere. Hareton has been saved from a life of ignorance and poverty, tutored by Cathy into literacy, and returned by Heathcliff's death to his position. The love and devotion Cathy knew from her father has been restored by her impending marriage. Ultimately, Heathcliff himself no longer sees the meaning in his revenge. It is because of this that he decides to focus on the afterlife, where he and Catherine can be reunited. Chapter 34, Summary and Analysis. Summary. Following his discussion with Nelly, Heathcliff fails to show up for his meals, shunning all company. Nelly learns that he has been walking outdoors all night. One morning, Cathy is startled by Heathcliff's return, reporting to Hareton and Nelly that Heathcliff actually spoke to her without his customary threatening manner. Indeed, she could swear he seemed excited and cheerful. Concerned and confused, Nelly decides to investigate. She too notices, quote, a strange, joyful glitter in his eyes, unquote. Refusing breakfast, Heathcliff asks to be left alone. At noon, he attempts a full plate of food, declaring himself ready to eat at last. However, after a few mouthfuls, he pushes the food away and paces outside in the garden as a perplexed Hareton tries to find out what the problem is. Hareton, too, finds Heathcliff in a rare unhappy mood, although Heathcliff asks Hareton to leave him in solitude. When he returns an hour or two later, Nelly remarks on the unnatural, chilling appearance of Heathcliff's face. He is pale and shivering from nervous agitation. Nelly begs him to let her know why he is acting so strangely. Has he had good news? Heathcliff reports that he is, quote, within sight of heaven, unquote, and repeats his desire to be left alone. No one disturbs him in his room until Nelly attempts to bring him food at 8 that night. Nelly is truly panicked at how Heathcliff looks. He appears to be a goblin, not a man. Feeling foolish but terrified, she runs out. Quote, is he a ghoul or a vampire? Unquote, she ponders. Reminding herself that she has known Heathcliff since he was a small child, Nelly tries to rationalize her unease. She spends a fitful night trying to make sense of Heathcliff's suspicious origins, and eventually dreams of his death and funeral. She is disturbed that she, his confidant for nearly 40 years, does not know his surname or the date of his birth, and therefore his tombstone can be inscribed only with his single name and the date of his death. By morning, Nelly feels calmer, until Heathcliff appears for breakfast and continues in his strange behaviour. Ignoring the coffee she puts before him, he smiles at some unseen vision, his face so ghastly that Nelly cries out. Heathcliff tells her to be quiet and asks if they are alone, despite the fact that the kitchen is obviously empty except for them. Brushing away the food, Heathcliff leans across the table, continuing to stare at something that Nelly cannot see. Finally, he leaves and does not return until after midnight. Awake when he returns, Nelly hears him call, "Catherine," speaking as if Catherine were indeed beside him. Too frightened to confront him, she remains in bed until dawn, when he summons her. He wants her to send for Mr. Green, the lawyer, so that he can write a will, although he does not yet know how he will dispose of his property. Nelly advises him to wait until he has eaten and rested. The past 3 days have taken their toll on his nerves. Heathcliff says he cannot rest until he, quote, reaches what is waiting, unquote, for him, and then changes his mind about writing a will. Unable to understand Heathcliff's mystical speech, Nelly advises him to send for a minister and seek salvation from the Bible, fearing that he will be unfit for heaven unless he does. Rejecting the idea of a minister, Heathcliff thanks her nevertheless for reminding him of how he wishes to be buried. He wants only her and Hareton to accompany his coffin to the churchyard, warning her to obey his earlier instructions about being buried next to Catherine, unless she wants to be haunted by his angry spirit. That night, everyone hears Heathcliff groaning and murmuring in his room. Hareton and Nelly decide to send for the doctor, but when he knocks at the door, Heathcliff curses and sends him away. The following evening, during a pouring rain, Nelly observes the window to Heathcliff's room swinging open. Running upstairs to look, Nelly sees Heathcliff's dead body drenched with rain on the bed. Kneeling by his side, Nelly tries to close the dead man's eyes, but rigor mortis has set in. His entire face is frozen in a contemptible sneer. Joseph comes in, but refuses to touch Heathcliff, saying the devil has finally carried him off. Falling to his knees, Joseph prays, thanking heaven for returning Hareton to his lawful position in this ancient family. Despite the gossip it incurs, Heathcliff is buried as he had requested, on one side of Catherine. Edgar's grave remains on her other side. Hareton weeps as he digs the grave. Her long narrative finally draws to a close. Nelly tells Lockwood that many, Joseph included, believe Heathcliff haunts the moors. A little shepherd boy has told Nelly of seeing Heathcliff and a woman standing on the road. While she claims not to believe this, she admits to being too frightened to venture outdoors at night, and eagerly awaits Hareton and Cathy's marriage on New Year's so she can move back to the Grange. Lockwood walks back to spend his final night at the Grange before returning to London. Looking up at the sky, he enjoys the scent of flowers and the breeze, wondering about the restless souls beneath him. Discussion and analysis. While everyone else in the family is taken aback at Heathcliff's queer state, the reader has a fair idea that Catherine's spirit has at last made contact with Heathcliff. It is undoubtedly at her he stares while in the kitchen with Nelly, and it is surely she to whom he speaks as he mounts the stairs at night. As Catherine was the only joy Heathcliff has ever known, only she could have produced in him the uncharacteristic happiness and agitation noticed by the others. The culmination of Heathcliff's life, therefore, is not in revenge against Hindley and the Lintons. We can assume he has considered writing a will in order to restore at least Hareton's, if not Cathy's, inheritances. He rejects the idea of calling the lawyer, finally, because he can think of nothing but finding peace and fulfilment with Catherine. Since this can only happen once he is dead, he awaits death with some impatience, content to know he will soon be spending eternity at Catherine's side. Chapters 32 and 33, Summary and Analysis. Summary. It is September 1802. Visiting a friend in northern England, Lockwood realizes he is only 14 miles away from Thrushcross Grange. Acting on impulse, he decides to spend the night there. Since he is still paying rent to Heath, strangely, he spies Cathy and Hareton engaged in a reading lesson interrupted by kisses and other signs of affection. Unseen, Lockwood slides past them into the kitchen, where Nelly sits singing as she sews. She is delighted to see Lockwood again, but is surprised to discover that he is unaware of Heathcliff's death 3 months ago, as Cliff for the house. On arriving, he meets an unfamiliar servant, who tells him Nelly has moved into Wuthering Heights. Curious, Lockwood walks over to see how everyone is doing. There is something different about the formerly foreboding place. The gate is no longer locked against visitors, and flowers bloom profusely in the garden. Most Lockwood sip some ale, she narrates the story of his queer death. 2 weeks after Lockwood's departure, Nelly is summoned to the Heights. Heathcliff explains that he no longer wishes to see Cathy, so he wants Nelly to move in and make a small apartment for herself and the girl. The arrangement soon proves unsatisfactory. Cathy resents being confined to a small space all day, and is reduced to fighting with Joseph in the kitchen. Hareton also frequents the kitchen, where he continues to be the victim of Cathy's scorn. One day, Cathy relents and offers to let Hareton try to read one of her books. When he rebuffs her offer, she leaves the book beside him. Still unable to make amends, Cathy finally